I think strategically, Russia's failed. It's also wrecked its economy, killed a huge number of people, and it's got lasting social problems, and it's ruptured itself from Europe as well. So, I think I agree with Simon. We should be supporting Zelensky politically, financially, militarily, and diplomatically at this stage. But I think overplaying our hand with the Americans and saying, we can throw our hands up in the air and sort of say we're going to walk away, I think is misguided because, as another official said, we can't do this on our own for another decade. We need the Americans.
Now, with President Trump giving Ukraine's President Zelensky until Thursday to agree this peace plan, which has been cooked up by the US envoy Steve Witkoff and his Russian counterpart, European leaders are really busy. They've sort of been left out in the cold, but they're now trying to get involved. They're scrambling to try and improve the terms of this deal. They're basically trying to get in on this deal. Now, it's a 28-point plan, which calls on Ukraine to cede territory, accept limits on its military and renounce ambitions to join NATO. Now, with Europe and the so-called coalition of the willing having been completely bypassed in terms of these secret negotiations, European leaders are meeting at the G20 summit in South Africa. And they've just released a joint statement today. They've expressed concern about proposed limitations on the Ukrainian army because they think it will leave it vulnerable to attack. They've also insisted that Ukraine's borders must not be altered. And they added the elements of the plan relating to the EU and NATO require their consent. Now, European leaders are thought to be considering the possibility of going to Washington to hold direct talks with President Trump, although Keir Starmer, for once, is not going to be with them because he has to come back because there's this thing, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called the budget. It's probably happening next week. We've hardly talked about it here on Times Radio, so he is not going to be doing that. He will have to be in Blighty doing the budget. Well, let's now speak with John Foreman. John is a former defence attache at the British embassies in Kyiv and Moscow. John, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Alicia.
So, look, what do you think is going to happen here? Because it does feel that European leaders, including Keir Starmer, despite all their best efforts and doing lots of, chatting to Trump and being on good terms with Trump, have kind of been left out in the cold in terms of this deal. Do you think they're going to be able to sort of get involved at this stage?
I think they've been left out basically most of this year. I think if you remember back into February when Trump first announced he was going to speak to Putin about sorting out, as he saw it, the war in Ukraine over the heads of the Europeans, directly with the Russians, and then perhaps with some Ukrainian involvement, the Europeans put their hands up in the air. Then we had this sort of coalition of willing process to sort of edge themselves back in terms of providing a security force or perhaps providing sort of security guarantees. And then we had the Alaska summit, which again the Europeans weren't at, and then we had the meeting, which was going to set up another meeting in Budapest or talk about the bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin. Again, the Europeans weren't going to be there, and we're seeing that process again. So I said on X, I thought the Europeans would be chirping from the sidelines. They're still talking about a ceasefire, for example, as a first step. Well, actually, Trump moved past the ceasefire first process back in August. He's now looking for a big, beautiful deal to try and sort everything out all at the same time.
And as you say, it does feel like European leaders and indeed Keir Starmer have been left out in the cold. So if they do get together, which they have done, and they are, they've sort of set out what they think should happen, do you think Trump is going to pay any attention? I very much doubt Putin will pay any attention to them, but will Trump pay any attention to them?
Well, I think the most important thing is helping Ukraine. Should we say refine, I think the word was, additional work on the deal on the table. And, we know that the Ukrainians are going to be meeting the Americans in Geneva at a very high level. Secretary of State Rubio and, a big cast of leading figures on the Ukrainian side to get into the detail. Because I think, personally, there is a framework in there somewhere which, subject to further work, could be acceptable to both Ukraine and Russia. And I think on that process, I think Europe, key European figures could help Ukraine finesse the document, shall we say, but not reject it outright, which I think President Zelensky was right to do yesterday. And I think the European leaders have been right to do that in South Africa. Now, mercy missions to Washington are fraught with danger. I think there are those in Europe that Trump listens to, the president of Finland, the chancellor of Germany.
Maloney.
Not so much Maloney, not so much Macron. You said Starmer may not be here. over there. So I think that has worked in the past, but again, we know how capricious Trump can be. I think at this stage it's necessary for calm, focus on what's on the table, work with the Americans to refine it, and not have a massive public blow up in the Oval Office again.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like not a huge amount of progress has been made. Now this deal has been cooked up behind the scenes. Obviously, there's some quite big threats that have been put on the table to Ukraine in terms of America withholding very crucial intelligence information and other vital support. Do you feel that President Trump and America are kind of pushing Zelensky into a corner?
Well, I think there's two issues here. I mean, firstly, in reality, though, back in the real world, away from all these sort of smoke-filled rooms, Ukraine's in a very perilous position. We've had the political shock of the corruption scandal
Yeah.
emerging. Ukraine's running out of money. There's going to need billions and billions of dollars to carry on fighting next year. The battlefield is going backwards, about to lose Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian city has been pummeled. Putin's not giving way, and Trump's now bringing this pressure to bear. And I think that's very Trumpian. He's very much into the maximum pressure at all times. That's why he imposed those sanctions onto Russia, on the oil sector, and threatened, there's that threat of 500% tariffs on Russian goods. And I think you're seeing the same hardball tactics played out on the Ukrainian side. It's not pretty, and it's not part of the FCO-like process. We'll sit down and have years and years of talk. It's very much the Trumpian way. But I don't agree with those who are saying this is a surrender and appeasement and betrayal. We had those accusations before. I think Trump has said he wants to get this done, and he's trying to do everything he can to get it over the line.
I'll just read a couple of messages that have come in, John. Dominic's messaged in saying, please can we stop referring to the 28-point peace plan and call it what it is? It's a surrender plan. Everything is what it is. It's not something else. Why use the language of the US and Russia? They're using language to create reality rather than reflect it. And something that Lee said, NATO and European leaders need to make a stand against America. It's clear that they are prepared to abandon Ukraine and NATO if this happens. The Baltic states will be attacked next. It's time for some backbone. Ukraine cannot be sacrificed like Hungary was in 1956. I mean, what do you think about those comments? I mean, clearly, some of my listeners have got very strong views. They do feel that America is siding with Russia and kind of turning its back on NATO and Europe.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you on Dominic's point. My goal since 2024 for the peace process has been a viable, free and sovereign Ukraine, which is anchored to Europe. And, if you look at the deal, or the proposed deal, subject to further work, the deal as it stands would preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. It would retain 80% of Ukrainian territory. The army would be at 500,000, which is much greater than what the Russians demanded in 2022, which was 75,000. They had an EU membership, reconstruction aid. There'd be no de facto or de jure recognition of the occupied territories, the return of POWs and children, and US security guarantees. So that's the offer on the table. I mean, it's not without its problems. I'm not convinced Putin's going to sign up to it, but I think it is a basis of further work. And I think using these terms like appeasement, surrender, betrayal, which I've been accused of today of being a useful idiot and a Russian agent and appeaser, I think is unhelpful, because I think ultimately there's four key issues. One is how to stop the killing. Two, how to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. Three, make sure is it acceptable to both Ukraine and Russia? This is for Ukraine to decide, not me or the Americans or the Europeans, and real credible security guarantees for going forward. So I think that's where our focus should be, and rather than just throwing around these terms, because we like to remember what happened in 1938, not standing up to Hitler. And secondly, on NATO and EU, I was in Vilnius this week, and at a conference, somebody asked this question about, the Baltics are next, and they said they're not next. They want NATO to stand firm. They think the transatlantic alliance is absolutely key. So it's taking firm stands or standing against NATO and EU or together against America, I think, is misguided, because ultimately the US is the ultimate guarantor of European security. We must do everything possible to keep the Americans in and the Russians out.
Although I suppose many people just feel that because this deal has been done really without Ukraine being at the table, it feels like, well, this is how many of my listeners are seeing it. It does feel like they see this as kind of America and Russia getting together really against Europe. I'll just read another message that's come in from Simon. He says, Aisha, now more than ever is the time that European leaders should stand up and voice their wholehearted support for Ukraine and Zelensky and put Trump in his place. It's ludicrous that the Americans should agree ceasefire conditions over Zelensky's head and threaten to withdraw security sharing if he doesn't agree. The conditions are totally unacceptable and give Putin a reward for the appalling conflict he has inflicted on the Ukrainian people and increase the threat to Europe's security in the future. That's from Simon. I suppose the anxiety is that, at the moment, this deal looks like it does give Russia a lot, not everything, but it does give Russia a lot. And I suppose people's concerns are, once this deal is done, let's say it's done, what then stops Russia coming back for more?
Yeah. Well, I think firstly, if you look back at the original goals in 2022 when I was in Moscow, Putin's goals were maximalist. They were, subjugation of Ukraine, driving out Zelensky and the elected government, imposing a puppet leader, and dealing with Ukrainian opposition by basically killing them, filtering them, or deporting to the east. So that was the plan. They failed to do that. Russia has ruptured its relationship with Ukraine permanently. I think Ukraine's destiny is now firmly towards Europe. And, it's taken 1 million killed or wounded to go 40 kilometers into Donetsk Oblast towards Pokrovsk. So I think strategically, Russia has failed. And it's also wrecked its economy, killed huge number of people. It's got lasting social problems, and it's ruptured itself from Europe as well. So I think I agree with Simon. We should be supporting Zelensky politically, financially, militarily, and diplomatically at this stage. But I think overplaying our hand with the Americans and saying, we can throw our hands up in the air and sort of say we're going to walk away, I think is misguided, because, as another official said, we can't do this on our own for another decade. We need the Americans.
Okay. Now, Keir Starmer has been speaking at the G20 about Ukraine. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
The plan, the 28-point plan, has a number of important elements which are essential to a just and lasting peace, and that's what we all want. There is more to do on the plan, and we've had a meeting this afternoon of like-minded leaders from the Coalition of the Willing who are here at the G20 to engage on that. And tomorrow in Geneva there'll be a meeting of senior US personnel, of Ukrainians, and of NSA's national security advisors from Europe, including my national security advisor, to take things further forward.
So that's Keir Starmer basically saying that they still want to be involved, that he's going to send his national security advisor to this gathering in Washington. Now, John, lots of my listeners are a bit cross with you. I mean, Robert says he thinks you're appeasing Russia. What do you say to that?
Well, I've been banned by Russia, so I don't think I am an appeaser. I think I'm a realist. I think the Ukraine can't win this. I think, unfortunately, the grim trajectory of the war is against Ukraine. It has been for almost 3 years, or 2.5 years. We're about to enter another winter. I mean, I think it's going to end up around the table and not on the battlefield. And I don't think we could give Ukraine as much weapons as possible. I don't think they've got the manpower now to drive the Russians out. Ukraine's been going backwards since 2023 when its offensive failed. So we can carry on fighting. But the question, of course, is what point, what end? Ukraine cannot regain its 2022 borders, let alone its 2014 borders. But I listened to Mr. Starmer carefully. Important elements, more to do. And I rarely agree with Mr. Starmer on many things, but I think the Coalition of the Willing is a useful political ginger group to keep key powers in Europe aligned. And I'm glad that, as I said at the beginning, that the British National Security Advisor, other key players, can be in there helping Ukraine and the Americans to get to an acceptable form of words. Okay,
but your general view is that this war has got to end, and this is the time to end it. And if this is the deal, this is the deal. It's best for it to end because Ukraine is not going to win this war.
I said that last year. I thought that 2025 is the most likely scenario was a messy, unsatisfactory peace deal between both sides. But as somebody said, the real issue is making sure that this thing sticks, and that requires security guarantees. Exactly,
that is the big thing, because it's one thing to make this war end, But I think all eyes will be, do we believe that Russia will just be like, yeah, let's sit back and not do anything else? I mean, we don't know the answer to that now. Well, look, John, really interesting talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. That's John Foreman, a former defence attaché at the British embassies in Kyiv and Moscow.